Greetings. Welcome to In Conversation with Trevor, brought to you by Heart and Soul Broadcasting Services. I go beyond the headlines and beyond the sensational. Today I'm in conversation with Dr. Tendai Murisa, the Executive Director of Sivio Institute. If you enjoy this conversation, remember to subscribe, to like, and to share. Dr. Tendai Murisa, welcome to In Conversation with Trevor.
Thank you so much for having me, Trevor. It's about time.
It's about time. It's about time because I've been seeing you on the sidelines commenting on some of the stuff that people have been saying on the show. So today we've got that opportunity to deal with some of those issues.
I'm probably one of the biggest fans of the show.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Sure. Tendai, I want us to start first of all by helping people understand what Sivio Institute is. Okay. When did you set it up? What does it do?
Thank you for that. Sivio Institute is a culmination of ideas. It has a birth date, a formal birth date, which is January 2018. That's when Sivio Institute is formally established. But as an idea, it starts off before that. By 2013, 2014, quite a number of us were beginning to think about beyond the crisis. What will Zimbabwe look like beyond the crisis? We did not know what would lead. Even up to now, we don't know what will take us out of the crisis. But we began to gather newly trained academics, thinkers, etc., from different fields to say, what if we put together a set of ideas to take us forward? Because at that particular moment, even up to now, the preoccupation was now to define the problem. So as Zimbabweans and even as Africans, we're very good at defining the problem. But rarely do we spend time thinking about the solutions, what will take us forward, etc. So we sat together with a team of 12 like-minded young scholars, development practitioners, activists. We devoted a week, 2 weeks, came up with an idea of a book, which I then co-edited with Dr. Tendai Murisa, which is called Beyond the Crisis, Zimbabwe's Prospects for Inclusive Transformation. Mm-hmm. So when we published that book in 2014 into 2015, we're not so sure what would happen. So come what happens in 2017, and also the changes in my own professional trajectory where I'm beginning to say, I'm leaving my Pan-African position, I'm coming back to settle in Zimbabwe. So there's a tension between myself in the family to say, do we come back to Zimbabwe or do we go and live in the United States where we had other job offers? Then we began to say that if not us, we'll contribute. And I also had a passion for my children. At that moment, we had one daughter, to make sure that they learn something about Zimbabwe. So I came back to Zimbabwe in 2017, spent a bit of time. There had been a personal tragedy at that time. I'd lost my mother. So Sivio is actually my mother's acronym. It's her surname and her first name combined. Because we also did not want a name that will limit us maybe to Zimbabwe or to a region.
So it's Sivio.
It's Sivio. So this is Sikweche Violet. So it's Sivio. Those are her names. So we lost my mom in 2017 in March.
I'm sorry about that.
So I was building upon that. But the idea had already congealed around a center that begins to think about solutions for moving us forward. That's what Sivio has become. A center that is working in Zimbabwe, registered in other jurisdictions, doing similar work in Zambia and in Malawi, and now hopefully in South Africa as well.
So in a nutshell, what issues are you focusing on? What work are you doing?
Okay. So when we came up with the book, there was a set of questions that we raised. We said, number one, how do we reduce poverty and inequality in Zimbabwe? Number two, how do we make sure that we reduce dependency? Number three, what would it take to have a democracy that works in Zimbabwe and in Africa? But we focused in our book on Zimbabwe. So if you look at Sivio is organized around 3 centers. So there's a center that is focused on civic engagement. That is about how do we make sure that the manner in which citizens I'm not talking of the political party formation, but all of us who are not office holders can actually influence or have a part to play in governance, day-to-day governance issues. That center is directed by this hypothesis or statement that we use at the office. Elections are a necessary but not sufficient condition for democracy. Then you ask, what is it that is required? Then we say we need to build citizens. And I'll come back to the story. You shared an interesting encounter at Rowan Martin that you had recently. When I read that, I said, he's summing up the work of Sivio Institute. That civic engagement, the work that you said, you had a confrontation with officers that were ignoring you. Then we said, this is exactly what we're trying to say. Our democracy, the pulse of our democracy is when ordinary citizens can walk into offices and ask certain questions. So that's one center. Another thing we raised because of the issues to do with dependency. Most of us, we realize that in Africa, we shape Africa's development from a deficit perspective. We always make this assumption to say, oh, somebody has to come and help us. So it's always looking to somebody. So let's take government. The government solution or their theory of change is around what you call foreign direct investment. So we're waiting on somebody to come and save us. Same as other poor and everyone. If you go to any community that is struggling, they'll say, we are hoping you are the donor, or we're hoping that donors can come and help.
Or you're the government.
Or
the
you're the
government will do this for us.
So we have a deficit mindset. So we began to say, how do we think about assets and mobilizing locally available assets? So we call that center the Center of Philanthropy and Community Inclusion. But our thinking was just not the philanthropy that you read about, that which, say, Bill Gates or Strive Masiwa does, but the philanthropy which is a day-to-day form of solidarity amongst ourselves. So that's how we began to say that that's how we can reduce dependency. Then when it comes to the question around how do we make sure we create employment, we set up a center for entrepreneurship, which has gone through various changes. Because we thought, like, if we're going to be facing challenges of creation of jobs, what if we help to develop a new cohort of entrepreneurs that are socially minded, but also that are looking inward within the country to begin to say, my mandate is not just a profit, but my mandate is to create jobs, sustainable jobs, dignified jobs. So those are the three centers that we set out with, and that has been our strategy to say we want to achieve.
Are you seeing any traction? Are there any tangible results from the three centers that you've set up that you can share with us?
Oh yes, our Center for Civic Engagement, where we actually train public policy analysis, advocacy, but also we are one of a few, or the only one, that actually keeps a daily tracker of how government is performing. So it has helped us to have different kinds of conversations with government. So what we're beginning to see is to say, initially there was a pushback. So we're called all sorts of names. Government called us a regime change agenda setting organization. Opposition types also, because in some places would rate government performance highly. So they also said we are pro-government. So you find yourself in the middle. But what we found as
a good place to be.
Oh yes, but it's unpopular in Zimbabwe,
of course,
given our partisan polarization. So we found ourselves now creating new conversations around evidence and the challenges. So the real issue for us was not about is government performing well or not. The real issue is to say, whose agenda is government pursuing? So for instance, everything that we see, especially with the introduction of this new currency, the argument we have made is saying, the idea could have been brilliant, but you are bringing us to an idea that you have formulated and completed by yourself.
We were not there.
You were not there. Exactly. We're not there at its conception. You never consulted us. So even the idea of consultation is to sell you an idea. They are salespeople. They're selling you what they
do it badly, I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, they're bad salespeople.
So the as far as entrepreneurship is concerned, what traction are you making?
Oh yes. So that has been, on the one hand, the most exciting work, but on the other hand, the most difficult work. I'm trained as a political science activist, practitioner, and academic. Most of my work has been around development, hardcore development issues, and also to do with policy, to do with advocacy and governance. So entrepreneurship is a new space. So in terms of mobilizing resources required for what we thought we could do, we wanted to set up entrepreneurship hubs across all the 10 provinces. That vision is yet to manifest.
Okay.
But I'm glad to say, Trevor, we've trained over 80 young entrepreneurs. They have gone through our School of Entrepreneurship. And we also have an entrepreneurship hub on our website where anyone thinking of entrepreneurship in Zimbabwe can go to that online repository and get all the materials to do with how to register your company, what do you need for compliance, what licenses do you need per value chain. And we begin to say, let's map up opportunities within each value chain. So in terms of being an information hub, we've done very well. When we started, we did not want to end there. We thought we could raise resources that we could then say, everyone who's gone through our training also gets startup financing. That has been the issue. We are yet to get there, but we have not given up. We're still trying to talk to different banks, different institutions, like the National Pensions Authority in this country. It sits on a lot of money, but it's not supporting young entrepreneurs. To begin to say, what kind of interventions can we make for these? Because for every country, Trevor, that has developed, you'll know it has been at the backbone of entrepreneurship.
Absolutely.
Here we call it informal sector, but others call it cottage industry. So it's actually the terms we use, and then we think it's about reining on it, controlling it, or taxing it. We love taxing them, but we don't give them incentives. So we have also engaged from a policy perspective to say there are certain incentives that need to be given for us to promote entrepreneurship in Zimbabwe.
Tell me, you say this has brought you to spaces where you are having interesting conversations. Just talk to us briefly about the interesting conversations that you've had with the opposition and interesting conversations that you've had with government because of the work that you're doing, as briefly as possible.
Okay, so we keep what we call a local government tracker. So we're tracking the performance of Bulawayo, Harare, Gweru, and Mutare. That became very interesting because obviously those councils were struggling with service delivery. But just by writing a report like that, our opposition, for so many years, we've been saying this, to say our opposition needs to be also to be put on the what? On the same pedestal in terms of analysis. We need to analyze them, to expose to them their challenges. But they've always been held as victims. So they've never been put under scrutiny. But we have to appreciate that the opposition in Zimbabwe, especially the MDC Alliance and maybe the CCC, they've always run urban authorities since Morgan Tsvangirai
Say
days.
that again.
So they have been, yes, in opposition. They failed to take over national power, but they have run local authorities across. So the rot that we see in local authorities, the blame has to be apportioned also on them. But it's a challenge that they have not taken on board easily. Because for them, they then argue that it's the meddling of the Minister of Local Government. But I asked the spokesperson for the then president of the MDC Alliance in a meeting, I said, are you saying the minister is stopping you from collecting litter? Because refuse collection in the CBD was a major issue. I said, is there a rule?
It's still a major issue.
It remains a major issue almost everywhere across Harare and Blue. I said, are we saying that there is an instruction from the Minister of Local Government that you cannot collect litter? So I think we hide under excuses. Same thing with the Zimbabwe government.
Yeah.
Because when we then engage the national government, they also try to refer to us to sanctions, to say we cannot do this because of sanctions. So you find that what we are having is a challenge of excuses. We cannot take ownership of problems and then begin to say, if it's our problem, we can fix.
Tendai, I think right there is the nub of the issue, because the opposition is not taking ownership. They're finding excuses. The government is not taking ownership. They're finding excuses. What's wrong with us? You do ask that question.
Yeah.
What is wrong with Zimbabwe? What's become of us as a people? Forget the political titles. What's become wrong with us? What's happened to us?
That's a big question, Trevor. I've begun, and not out of frustration, but actually out of feeling, because I think when I started Sivio Institute, there was a level of optimism, and maybe I was naive in a certain way. Because I think that question you are asking could be to do with mindset. So there are two issues that...
I think I'm going to hold you there, because this is a very important answer. I'm being told that I'm running out of my first 20 minutes.
Okay.
That's an important question. What's happened to us? So when we come back, we're going to take a break. Viewers at home, don't go away. When we come back, we're going to drill into that question. What's happened to our state of mind? Not political parties, but us as citizens. See you on the other side.
Democracy is not an event, it's a culture.
Welcome back to our conversation with Dr. Tendai Murisa, the Executive Director of Sivio Institute. That's the right name. So before we took the break, you were just about to get into your stride of trying to explain what's happened to our psyche, what's happened to us as Zimbabweans over the past 24 years. I think not 24 years, 40 years?
44.
44 years. The context being, you talk to the opposition, they have a pile of excuses why things are not working.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them okay, some of them not okay. You talk to the government, a pile of excuses, the biggest being sanctions and all sorts of things.
Sure.
We do not take responsibility as Zimbabweans to say, this is what we messed up, this is what we're going to fix. And my question to you is, what's happened to us?
So I'm grateful that you raised this, and I'm grateful that you've also allowed us to say, let's think about from a 44-year perspective. Because I think there are two sort of sets of tendencies. The first tendency that we saw in 1980, which then resonates in 2017, is of high expectation that things are going to change overnight. So I was young in 1980, so what I have is a basis of what I've read, that there were these wildcat strikes that people thought, oh, we're getting jobs, we're getting this, etc. We're even taking over houses that were owned by white people. So fast forward to 2017, we've almost exactly the same thing when we have that euphoria around the removal of President Mugabe. So we're actually thinking that overnight we're going to change things and things are going to shift. So I think we have a challenge around silver bullet solutions. We do not know what it takes to build a nation. That's number one. Then number two, amongst us as citizens, we have also another challenge, which you raised, what I call messianic politics. That we think the solution is to vote for an individual, and that individual will fix everything. So we have this saying at Sivio that citizens vote, politicians promise, but nothing happens in the middle. Because we are made to expect that if we vote, we're done. So we depart from the public space. We go into our private places. We do not think of anything we should consider as collective work. So you have that mindset shift. So you can see even, Trevor, in high-income areas, the newly developed. So you see these high-rise buildings, well done, but look outside their gate. The roads are underdone. There's litter everywhere. Try to talk to those people living in there. Or council should do it. It's council's role. Despite the fact that we can see the collapse of council, that council has no wherewithal, the capacity to do it. And many studies have shown us, even from OECD countries, that we now have to think a different framework around governance. Now we think as citizens, we work with government, not government works for us. So that's one challenge. Then there's this challenge that you raised around, it's sanctions, or it's government that is meddling in our affairs. So we are good at making excuses. So, but I think we need to be humble enough and to learn from countries that decolonized earlier than us, or countries that were never colonized like Ethiopia. When you visit Ethiopia, over time, you actually see the changes. When you visit Nigeria, Ghana, you see something. There's something about the psyche about people who had never had settler colonialism.
That's true.
We have this self-confidence that we are African and we are enough. So at times the challenge is about, because everything that we do at the moment is to compare with the previous era. The whites were better. This large-scale commercial farmers were better. This is worse. So until we come to a place whereby we begin to have confidence in ourselves, confidence in the businesses that you establish, that we respect the entrepreneurs of the 80s and 90s, the post-independence entrepreneurs, and to seek to say, what do we learn from those who carved a path for us? Then we begin to build upon those successes. So the stories of successful entrepreneurship are not being properly harvested for the next generation.
And celebrated
adequately. So we need to be able to celebrate each and every moment. When we do that, we begin to have some self-assurance around saying, you know what, we are enough as Zimbabweans. Because at the moment, it looks like we're waiting for Godard. We are waiting for the Messiah to come and take us to the promised land. So even if you understand the politics, it's about when is Moses taking us to the promised land. So we don't see ourselves as if we're enough in our collective spaces. And yet, politics itself is not about the event called an election. It's an everyday thing.
Absolutely. And politics is not about the election of a Messiah.
Sure.
Like you said.
Yes.
Are you taking care of your neighborhood? And if your neighborhood is broken down because city council is not functioning, I want you to push back, Tendai, if you may. You either hold a council to account, or you find ways of working with council to make things work. Is that a fair representation of what should happen?
That's what we need. I'm not so sure if your readers have read your blog around encounter you had at Rowan Martin. Because for me, it's like, what if there were 10 or 20 Trevors doing what you were doing on that day, on a day-to-day basis? Wouldn't the service change? Because what we miss in our country is we have little Hitlers everywhere. So the person saving you feels like they have so much power that they can tell you when to come for service, or they can ignore you when you're standing in front of them, because we've not demanded service from them. So we lack capacity to go there and say, I'm a ratepayer, I'm here to be served because it's my rates that pay your salary.
I'm going to hold you there, Tendai. Is it not that we have seen the wrong kind of leadership modeled in front of us? I go so far, Tendai, as saying that we have a little Robert Mugabe's in all of us.
Yes.
Because this is the kind of leadership that we are used to seeing. So when I go to council and stand behind the counter, I'm the little Robert Mugabe, and I'm going to tell you where to go off.
Yes.
And we're finding the same thing in the opposition politics.
Oh, yes.
I am the little Robert Mugabe in charge of this opposition, and I'm going to tell you where to go, get off. Push back, please, if you may.
No. You're very right. That observation you have made, that's why for some of us, we're actually saying, and you find that many times when we talk about politics, we're actually moving away from these partisan toxic spaces, but we're beginning to move towards saying, what can citizens do in their collective spaces? Because what we're trying to say is we need to model a certain citizen behavior. Because that citizen behavior can shape leaders. Because half the time we've thought that leaders need to come and shape us, but we want to put it the other way around. Let's get in our collective spaces. Let's model something. So in our neighborhood, if we were to change and begin to fix our roads, collect litter, make sure that there's security, by fixing our problems, whoever wants to come and say, I want to be a ward councillor, we're now asking a different question because we're engaged in the community to say, what do you propose that you do with us, not for us? Because the chefism, that's what you call it. Chef is like, they come and say, if you vote for me.
They know it all.
Yeah, if you vote for me, I'll do this for you, I'll do this for you, I'll do this for you. But that's what has gone wrong with our politics.
My theory, and pushback as much as you're able to, Tendai, is we have people saying we need new leaders. I'm saying no, we don't need new leaders. We need a new you and I. We are going to produce the leaders by the way we conduct ourselves, by the way we lead ourselves, by the way we lead in our communities, not the leaders. These leaders that we have messed us up. Push back if you may.
I'm not so sure if you appreciate how nuanced your position is. Because what you are saying is democracy is not an event, it's a culture. We need to move away from looking at democracy and equate it to an event called maybe elections or running for office. But what you are saying is you're talking about our everyday interactions, that they need to be democratic in nature. And what do I mean by that? That they need to be based on respect, on solidarity, on care,
on values,
virtues, on integrity. But we model it in our micro interactions. Then before you know it, that begins to permeate across society. So I've always found that when people talk about democracy in this country, they're looking at an event. But when I read what you're saying in your pushback, because I've seen that hashtag, we need new leaders or a certain political party must go. I agree with those positions, but I'm saying that it starts here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because
it starts with me.
It starts with all of us doing something different, being engaged. Because the challenge with us, whether you're poor or you're rich, our levels of engagement are limited by our gates.
Yes,
we just don't go beyond our gates to begin to talk to neighbors.
Tendai, you and I could talk the whole day, but let me take you to one thing that you highlight. You say your big bet for 2024 is, and this is huge, your big bet is, and I quote, farewell to political parties, long live engaged communities. Unpack that for us.
Wow. So this comes from a place of deep frustration with assumptions that our lives should be organized around political parties. And a conversation like this, somebody listening to us may want to box us into a certain political party. But when you begin to realize that what has actually caused the tension, caused the disharmony, the lack of coherence or unity in our country is actually political parties dividing us. Because if you were to remove that, you actually realize that we belong to other associational platforms and we do well there. We belong to residents associations, we belong to churches, we belong to football, we support football clubs. We do things and we do it well there. But when it comes to politics, it's so toxic. So I think...
and sometimes the politics then affects the way we support our football parties and their football clubs.
Exactly.
And stuff. So I break your stride.
So as a Shona-speaking person raised in Bulawayo, I've actually received pushback to say how I can support Highlanders. I didn't realize that Highlanders belong to a certain tribe. So those are the challenges that we have because of our toxic partisan politics. So I think when we break that and we begin to say, if we start off by talking about engaged communities, where are people on a day-to-day basis? Where does Trevor get help? Where does Trevor talk? Who does he talk to on a day-to-day basis? It's probably his neighbors, people in his church, his friends from your former school. But if you look at Zimbabwe, especially in our work on philanthropy, the things that are shifting, where we're shifting the needle, is when people realize their collective capacity and say, let's mobilize our money as former students of Umzingwane High School. Let's go back and do something at Umzingwane. Let's go and do something at Kutama, at Goromonzi. We're seeing those move. But those are just initial shoots of what can be a bigger movement when citizens realize their potential and their capacities. That's the spirit of the big bet, to say, if we begin to realize our assets and begin to mobilize, $1 collected amongst 1,000 people can
go $1,000.
It's $1,000. $10 is 10,000. We can fix the problems that we face in our communities when we begin to think that way. Then we don't fold our hands like this, waiting for somebody to come and save us. That's the whole idea of engaged communities.
The other thing I like, I mean, the time we have is not enough. The other thing I love about you is this letter that you write to your daughter, Dear Dalitso. And you say these are mentorship letters to your daughter about everyday lessons. Talk to me about the idea that brought about this Dear Dalitso. It's a beautiful part of your website, and I would really encourage viewers to visit that and read your letters to Dalitso. Where did this idea come from?
So I've always had, it comes from two places. Jawaharlal Nehru wrote glimpses of world history. And he wrote those when he was in prison, using his knowledge. And it was to his daughter, Indira Nehru then, who became Indira Gandhi and became the first female prime minister of India. So if you read that, it's a mentorship book, a thick book like this. He's talking to his daughter, teaching her politics, teaching her world history, etc. So when I got a copy of that as a gift from the late Sam Moo, I got fascinated with the idea. Then over time, when I began to realize that I lost my father in 1988, I was only Form 1. And I do not know much about what my father's ideas were concerning my life. My younger sister, the last in our family, does not remember our father's face. So I began to say, this life that we have is not given that we'll live until eternity. I need to put some things in place. I don't know what will happen. But the idea is, it's a letter that I share with Dalitso, but I'm also sharing with other children. So I send it to many of my friends to say, read it to your children, etc.
Beautiful.
And I'm trying to make sure that they can begin to have an appreciation of life early. My daughter is only 10 years old. But the questions she asks me after we've read the letter, and also what she's becoming as a person, based on the interactions we have, I can tell that it is necessary to try to affect them or to shape them while they're still young. And you'll find that the letter covers many topics. I talk about the journey of building an institution, the journey of showing up as a person, the journey leadership,
building an institution.
Yes. And the pain of going through all that, the challenges of that. And I think Dalitso has come to relate with me in a different way. I'm not Daddy, the superhero, but she understands my vulnerabilities based on that.
Oh, you touch my heart. Particularly, Tendai, in a country where drugs are ravaging our young people.
Sure.
Because fathers are absent, because communities are absent, because societies is not playing the role that it ought to play. And the issue that we spoke about, how do you show up as a person every day?
Sure.
Your ability to show up as a person every day is dependent to a large extent on who's been speaking to your life. And what you're doing to Daliso is what we ought to be doing to the young people that are being lost to drugs. So well done for that.
Thank you.
The other thing that you, obviously, for me, this gives us an opportunity to pay tribute to Sam Moo.
Sure.
Sam Moo, a colleague, a friend, a brother, who was passionate about land reform. I think to a very large extent, the way land reform ought to be done was personalized, or reflected rather, in his life. It never got done the way Sam would have wanted to.
Yeah.
Talk to me about this man, Sam, and the way he affected you.
So for me, I think Sam was, to many, Sam was a land scholar. But for me, Sam became a mentor that I never had. And I worked under Sam for close to 4 years as a research fellow at the Institute. And Sam was one of those passionate old school scholars, committed to the art of research and the rigor of research. And also in leading. He was a passionate leader, organizing, etc. So even the skills that I then took to when I moved from the institute that he led, which was the African Institute for Agrarian Studies, which is now the Sam Moo African Institute for Agrarian Studies, I believe I've implemented those ideas when I was at Trust Africa, or now when I established Sivio Institute. It was sort of, and even the connections. Sam, for many, Sam was a Zimbabwean. But for us who began to work and travel the continent with Sam,
He was an African.
Sam was everyone's son.
Yeah.
In Senegal, they celebrated Sam. I remember an ambassador from Senegal saying to Sam, "Oh, I can make sure you have land in Senegal." In Sierra Leone, it was the Sam. In Nigeria, it was the Sam.
Chain smoking, but Big Sam.
Oh, Big Sam. So we miss him, especially at this critical moment, because I wrote a piece to say, Sam will be shaking in the grave if he saw what we have done with land reform. Especially the unfinished questions around land tenure.
Shall we go there? I mean, may his soul rest in peace.
Sure.
And I'm delighted that you've named the institution after him. One question that you pose is, should we compensate white farmers? The government has agreed 3.5 billion to compensate white commercial farmers over the next 5 years or so. Some people say it's too little. Some people say it's too much. Where do you sit?
So I build upon Sam's argument. Before he passed on, Sam had actually written a piece that actually spoke to a compensation framework.
I'll hold you there again. Sam had written a piece that puts the framework for compensation.
Yes.
Viewers, when we come back, we're going to get into that package that Sam had put together. Should white commercial farmers be compensated or not compensated?
The amount of land we have in Zimbabwe could have enabled us to coexist with the large-scale commercial farmers.
Welcome back to our conversation with Dr. Tendai Murisa, the Executive Director of Sivio Institute. So as we took the break there, you were about to get into your stride in helping us understand where you sit, to compensate or not to compensate. To put the context, things into context, government has agreed a package, 3.5 billion, to compensate the white farmers over the next 5 years. Some people within the white community say it's too little. Some people, nationalists and the like, are saying it's too much. Where do you sit?
So I think it's not about where I sit, but I think there's a technical argument to be made first. The first argument is to understand that it's compensation for improvements made on the farms. So it's not compensation for land, because the popular argument is saying, why are we being made to buy back our land? That's not the issue. The issue is about farm improvements, movable things that were damaged, infrastructure that was on the farms, etc. So that's one. And number two, if you are going to talk about re-engagement as a country, you have to understand that you violated trade protocols globally. So what government used to do prior to fast-track land reform was to issue what they called a certificate of no present interest to a farmer on a farm that they had no interest in, to say, we're not going to take this land. So the farmer could take those title deeds and their certificate of no present interest, go to the Netherlands, go to Germany, go to South Africa, secure a loan to modernize and mechanize their farms. So that's why you found that in the Marondera area and also in the belt to Chinhoyi and Mazowe, with highly mechanized farms that were exporting flowers, etc. Those loans were secured on the basis of the certificate of no present interest. Then fast forward 2003, you then take over those farms. But these farmers are sitting on loans. They're sitting on huge debts. They go back to the banks and say, I no longer have the land. I can no longer service the loan. So what you're finding right now, if you're looking at what is the challenge of re-engagement for Zimbabwe, especially with the EU, it's actually, this is the elephant in the room. So you have to address it. So practically, we have to find a way of saying, how do we compensate? So is it about the amount? If you look at what the Commercial Farmers Union and also the Justice for Agriculture, which is a more radical offshoot of CFU, they were demanding in the region of 20 billion initially. There was a figure of 13 billion at some point. So if it has come down to 3.5 billion and it has been signed onto, I would say government has done a coup. I don't know how they arrived at that figure. I was also surprised, because all along when we were tracking this, the demand was always north of $10 billion. So we're in a place whereby if proper things, so we have a suggestion. Like I said, our institute is never about framing problems. So we said that everyone who's been given a land under fast track should be paying a lease. So if they paid that lease, you can raise this 3.5 billion over 5 years, because the land that is there should be productive, number one. And some people have more than one farm, and some people have got two farms that are too big. So the only way you can rein in on address the issue of farm sizes and single farm ownership is when you issue proper leases, and the lease is attached to a proper rental in good, determined by market forces. You can easily raise that. But also just not for compensation, but also for infrastructure that is required on the farms. Those areas no longer have serviceable roads, they are inaccessible, etc., because there are no resources. You cannot just expect that these things will happen on their own. The white commercial farmers who used to be there used to service those areas with their district councils. But in our instance, we're just hoping that there's an entity called central government. It should do everything. But if we collected these resources, but the challenge, Trevor, is the people who are supposed to pay are also the people who make policies. Will they come through and say, we're charging ourselves a levy, we're charging ourselves a lease? I don't think so.
How do we fix that?
So this is where we actually need, a government at some point was moving in a good direction where they were going to set up a land bank. So if you have a land bank and you say all the land that was distributed under fast track is now owned by this land bank, then you let that land bank collect a lease. You let policy making begin to direct you. Because if you're really going to transform this, you have to agree that there are certain difficult tensions that you have to engage with. No matter how unpopular it is, it takes us forward. At the moment, we are afraid of taking unpopular decisions.
As you're talking, Tendai, to me, a couple of words begin to rise to the surface, and those words are governance, personalities looming larger than policy, than governance. And the question also, was land reform done for the reasons that we assume it was done for, or to benefit a few people? I'll leave those questions there as you engage. See if which ones you want to take on, and I'm sure people out there will engage with those. But the one big one that I want to put before you is this: that so the land question is not resolved.
It is not.
We have black farmers having land being taken from them. The land issue remains a blank check that ZANU-PF is going to be writing for future political thing. Do you share that sentiment?
That is actually the tragedy of land reform. So there are 4 aspects to land reform. The first one is land redistribution. And there are errors as well. Some farms were taken that should not have been taken, especially those that belonged to black farmers that actually had purchased these farms, some of them post-independence, some of them just prior to independence, but still there was evidence that they were owned by black farmers. So that has not been resolved. And related to that is the issue to say that if you look even at the public pronouncement that the first president used to make, President Mugabe, to say that let's not touch Bipa farms. Even this compensation agreement you asked about, he said we should not touch Bipa estates because those are under bilateral partnerships, and actually we need to make sure that they are returned to their owners. So land redistribution needs cleaning up. And there's multiple farm ownership as a problem. Then there's the problem of utilization of land, our capacity to use land. That's the second strand. Our capacity to utilize land is related to the tenurial agreements that we have. In the absence of secure land tenure, there are very few people who are prepared to go and invest. Banks are not lending. So again, it remains unresolved. So there are all these technical issues that the government needs to be seized with. But from what I'm observing, governments deals with this issue in an ad hoc manner. Now and again, they come back to the land reform agenda and they try to resolve it. But what we are beginning to see, despite all the promising figures around the recovery in certain value chains, there's actually a growing problem of land underutilization. So many farms are being left to lie derelict. They are not being used because there's not enough financing, and some people have actually moved on. Despite having offer letters, there have been changes. Because these offer letters have been in place for over 20 years. Some people, unfortunately, have gone on to be with the Lord, and their sons or daughters have not inherited because the offer letter also has its own challenges. So there's need for another process of saying, how do we complete this process? It's not yet done.
It's not yet done.
And also, remember, your last question was around to say, was this what land reform was all about? I think land reform was captured by the political imperative. There was a reason for land reform from a development and economistic perspective, but that became subsumed around a political survival strategy at that particular moment. And that's when we lost the plot, because the amount of land we have in Zimbabwe could have enabled us to coexist with the large-scale commercial farmers.
We lost the plot. Can we get back to the track of realizing that land is an economic factor, that for you to work the land, you need financing. Financing to come to you, you need banks to be confident that they'll be able to come and get you their money from you. Can we ever get there?
That's the real challenge, to say, do we have the political will to push this, to make sure that it's done? So you are assuming on the one hand that government on its own and ZANU-PF as the ruling party is interested in that. But my sight of hope is not there. I'm hoping that the organized commercial farmers in their different unions, they begin to push for certain policies, and one of them being the resolution of tenure. The shift from these offer letters into either the permits or the leases, which are being offered for A1 and A2. But for that to happen, I think it's because if you're looking at it from a perspective that I benefited from land reform, I want to make sure that this land can pass on within the family. You want certain measures to be put in place. That's one. And bankers as well. Bankers coming up with a position to say, we realize that as a value chain, we are not active in it, agriculture, but we can only be active if we fixed the issues to do with tenure. So if we begin to see that traction, that advocacy from those players, we may begin to see a consensus around how we move forward. But we have stalled at the offer letter stage for too long. We've been here for 24 years, offer letter. But also it has to speak to the technical issues I was raising, to say, you cannot transfer this land given its contestations. You need to compensate first. You need them to surrender their title deeds, those who own the land.
Tendai, those are heavy issues. But nonetheless, issues that we need to tackle, and I'm delighted that you are raising it at Sivio Institute. One issue, Tendai, that you are passionate about is the illicit inflows from the continent. And I know the late Secretary General of the UN, the Ghanaian Kofi Annan, was also passionate about that. I know people like Mo Ibrahim continue to raise the flag around that. What's the situation?
Thanks for that, Trevor. I think that's the most sad part about Africa. You know, when I was at Trust Africa, this was a portfolio I led. We were one of the first organizations to raise this, working together with UNECA and also then the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, and also Thabo Mbeki. We worked with the former President of South Africa. He chaired a special commission for the AU together with UNECA on this issue. But in a nutshell, the position remains the same, that Africa pays more money than it receives in aid, and is driven by the model that Africa has been pursuing. The foreign direct-led investment, especially the big investments in mining, and the manner in which then their tactics, their techniques. That, because the challenge of illicit financial flows, we're not talking of people smuggling bags of money. We're talking of people moving their money even through the bank, and we can see that so much money has been moved. But it's because of issues to do with trade mispricing, under invoicing, etc. So you have a mining concern here, but you are selling to a similar company in offshore. It could be in another country that has got better laws, and you're selling that commodity at a cheaper price. And you know when you have sold to your agent, they will then on-sell at the right price. But the country of origin does not get that right price coming back. So that has been the challenge, that Africa is not benefiting even from the resource boom. Because since 2000 up to 2011, 12, thereabouts, Africa was in the middle of what we call a super cycle boom in terms of commodities, driven by China, which was literally hungry for minerals and other agricultural commodities. But Africa, despite the growth that we see in China, but we don't see it in Africa, despite Africa being the source of all the natural products. Like right now, there's a rush around lithium and cobalt because of the technological changes that we are seeing. But again, given our propensity to export things in their primary form, we are most likely going to remain in that challenge of illicit financial flows, because you cannot determine the price when you're just exporting raw stones in platinum, etc. Just
not value adding.
There's no value addition, so you can't determine the price. It's the same with cocoa, it's the same with coffee. That's our challenge, that for us to deal with illicit financial flows, it's not about making noise only at the United Nations, etc. It's also about insisting on value addition of across all value chains in coffee, cocoa, and minerals, etc. Because when we do that, then we have the ability to charge a price. But at the moment, we can't charge a price.
What are the opportunities of that happening? I mean, the thing with you, Tendai, you are working in this space where most issues are, this is heavy lifting stuff.
It is. It is.
What are the opportunities that we will find a solution around that? And as you're reflecting on that, I want you to factor in this issue. The emergence of China as the new colonial master, extracting in a big way. What's wrong with us Africans? And I know people out there will say it's not all of us Africans, but the picture that is being portrayed is of us not being proud of who we are, taking charge of our destiny, being assertive in things that are ours, adding value to our resources. What's your take to those issues that I raised?
So you're right. You know, we are seized with these big questions. So I think at the center of the challenge that Africa faces is the demise of the industrialization project. Because if we were industrializing, we'll be using our natural products. We'll be needing them and using them. But at the moment, the real challenge that we have is we are finding ourselves, especially now with the onset of Chinese-based influence in Africa. China is not interested in our industrialization. No. Definitely not. Europe was also not necessarily interested in that, because we are a market. We're a market for manufactured goods. So if you track figures in Africa around the contribution of manufacturing to GDP, as a portion of GDP, it's on the decline. Even South Africa, it's on the decline. So the real issue is industrialization, industrialization as a strategy is no longer popular. There are very few foreign funders who will fund Africa to industrialize. Because when you fund it, that means it is now has capacity to use its own raw materials and begin to sell finished goods. Then what happens to other regions? So this is a challenge, and unfortunately, that Africans have to tackle by themselves. But there's need, it cannot be done by a single country. We need to be thinking of it at sub-regional or at an Africa regional level. But in SADC, for instance, we have a challenge. If you look at South Africa is interested in looking at SADC as its market for its manufactured goods. Will it come to the party to say we are coming together with a SADC industrialization strategy? The comrades here tried it when they chaired the SADC 4 or 5 years ago, come up with an industrialization strategy. It remained at paper level. It did not receive support. So industrialization is actually a political project, but people cannot make the connection. Because once you start industrialization, you also deal with the problem of illicit financial flows. You also deal with the problem of aid. You reduce your dependence on aid because now your GDP begins to grow. But I think, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I think the world is structured in a way that Africa should remain where it is, unless Africans amongst themselves get organized. But at the moment, it's challenging to even have a conversation as Zimbabweans amongst ourselves. How about when we're talking about SADC or Africa? Can we agree on something and put our resources together and move a certain way?
Big questions. Do you ever feel despondent? I mean, you're tackling big issues. You are moving the needle. How hopeful are you?
So there are 3 aspects to my work. The first aspect is to make sure that we surface the need of conversations like this. So at times we feel like this is where we've been struggling because many people make it look like it's such an easy process. There's a lot of work, heavy lifting that has to be done, political will and financial resources to be invested in Africa's transformation. So that work, I'm glad, is taking place. We are beginning to find conversations in unlikely places. We find ourselves talking even to church leaders so that they have a proper understanding of the challenges we face. Then the actual work where we're beginning to see policies change, we are also beginning to see a bit of traction. But the real challenge for us is the third arm, practice. Because we can have the right policies, we can all talk about the same things, but it's about how much are you allocating to this agenda. Because in the absence of us defending our agendas with resources, we remain people who are good at talking. We can diagnose problems, we can say what needs to be done, but we are not moving to this third stage, which says, now let's put resources together.
Final issue, something that I also know you're passionate about, African philanthropy, in a nutshell. Are we a philanthropic people? Is our philanthropy different from the rest of the world? Talk to me about that as briefly as possible.
As briefly as possible. So I would say that there are 2 aspects to African philanthropy. There's the philanthropy done by the high net worth individuals. In this country, the most prominent philanthropists will be the Masiyiwas with their Higher Life and Delta philanthropies. And Patrice Motsepe in South Africa and many others, emerging black capitalists who are beginning to give away significant parts of their wealth to different causes. Where I say that they are unique is that these are people who are giving without tax incentives. Their counterparts in the US or in Europe, when they give, there's a huge tax cut that they get. But here, the more they give, actually, I'm told the revenue authorities begin to say, if you're giving so much money, that means maybe you're hiding some of your income. So I actually think they are giving from a certain different perspective than their counterparts in the West. That's one. So African philanthropists, even in Nigeria, it's a huge movement that we're seeing on the continent where Africans are coming together to mobilize resources. My challenge with African philanthropists, maybe except for Mo Ibrahim, is that they are afraid or they've avoided governance issues. They've gone for softer issues. They'll do scholarships, they'll do schools, they'll do bridges in their villages, they'll feed people, but they are not going to fund people like us, the kind of work that we do to say we want accountability in government. So and also it makes sense from a business perspective. Their businesses depend on licenses from government. They also depend on tenders, some of them from government. So for them to be seen in a position of confrontation is difficult. So we are hoping that as it matures as a sector, they'll be able to tackle these bigger questions that we're dealing with.
Wow, Tendai, those are big issues. I mean, when you, how do you want us to remember you? I mean, suddenly one day you kick the bucket. How would you want people to remember Dr. Tendai Murisa?
Wow. So I think it's about my passion and optimism around the Africa project. Because I will keep on saying that even though I work in Zimbabwe, my aspiration is Africa. And Africa in terms of its transformation. So one thing that disturbs me is to see our young people dying on the oceans, trying to cross into developed regions. If we can just, so for me, I think if anyone is to remember me, it was just the passion. And probably because of the passion, we've touched too many issues and failed maybe to concentrate on one that could have helped. So those, for me, it's just about the passion that I have for my continent. For us to be in Zimbabwe, it's literally by choice, because we could be somewhere else, but we felt like we needed to come to Zimbabwe
beautiful.
And contribute towards Zimbabwe's transformation.
You are an author.
Yes.
You have written a number of chapters in books. You've presided over the writing of books. You have brought us some books. I'm not going to let you go before we share books with our book-loving audience. This is perhaps one of the most watched part of the show. Okay. So what books do you have to share with us? At least 3 books.
3 books, right? Yeah. So I have the book by Malcolm Gladwell, Talking to Strangers. Malcolm Gladwell is one of my favorite authors.
I read this book. Fascinating.
Fascinating, right?
Fascinating, yeah.
So it's about, for me, it's, I have to deal with many things. How do I talk to somebody when they're looking for a job? How do I trust them? How do I talk to somebody when he's selling or she's selling me something? How do I relate with a politician when they're talking? So there are many things that Malcolm Gladwell raises to say, how do we develop that art of listening and observing? And it speaks to many things that we take for granted. We miss out on opportunities of how you craft a conversation with a stranger at a location. But for me, the insights, the takeaways was to understand. I think it's one of his most political work.
It is.
Because he's not talking about the misunderstandings that happen in policing in the United States by just trying to understand somebody who looks like me in the United States wearing a hoodie.
Is
the
profiled.
Stereotype that is developed. So for me, I began to say, how do we make sure that even law enforcers, etc., understand us in different places and in our context?
Then
this one is called by Peter Levine, Professor Peter Levine.
I love that. A Theory of Civic Life.
Yeah, what should we do? So what should we do, a Theory of Civic Life, is it takes us away from what Lenin posed as what must be done. Because at that moment, it was about thinking about what governments should do for us. But what Peter Levine is doing for us, he's saying to us, we need to be thinking about what we should do concerning public problems together. He implicates all of us in the public problems and brings in traditions of nonviolence, of deliberation, and also just collective action. Tolerance, to begin to say, there's a mandate for us to engage in collective action, to deliberate around issues, but to be tolerant of diverse perspectives. But bringing back the public problems back to us, not to say we just give them to somebody else to fix. And finally, Trevor, this is a book that I'm a fan of Malcolm Gladwell, but this is different by David Epstein, Range. Range challenges the 10,000-hour rule that was promoted by Malcolm. In Range, he is saying that pick many skills, different skills. And he uses the example of Roger Federer to say when Roger Federer, the great tennis icon, when he was a youngster, he actually played football and did other things before he played tennis. Then he played tennis. He is actually, even in music, many people who go on to specialize in music, it's not people who've gone through the college of music, but are people who have touched many things. So they bring all those experiences to what they do. So you can do that in leadership. So when I look at somebody like you were not trained as a journalist from my knowledge, but you've combined your training from economics and other things that you have done. Now you've come to have this show. So that's Range, picking things from all over and making sure that you develop this beautiful alchemy that can become something. So I like to use that a lot, because even if you look at Sivio Institute, we touch on many issues.
You do.
Because we refuse to be a silver bullet focused organization to say, if we fix this, we have fixed a continent. We appreciate the multiplicity of challenges that the continent faces.
And that's what humanity is,
Exactly.
isn't it?
Exactly.
Wow, Tendai, there's a lot of issues that I would have wanted us to touch on, but time is not always on our side. But,
Yes.
I really absolutely appreciate what you do. I think for me, Zimbabwe, to start with, the region and the continent, is going to be changed by people like you, doing the kind of beautiful work that you're doing, principled, long-term, strategic, not short-term profits, but looking, 5, 10, 20 years down the line, which is why I ask, when you kick the bucket, what do you want to be remembered as? So I really value what you do. People like our brother Sam Moo, we're still talking about the work that he did.
Yes,
That's
yes,
how
indeed.
important the work that you do is important. So we value you.
Thank you so much,
Tendai.
Trevor.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you for your
creating the time.
Thank you.
Allow me to tend to our viewers who are all over the world. Thank you for your support every week. Remember, we are a weekly show. We are out every Monday at 7 a.m. Central African time. To ensure that you don't miss out on any of these quality conversations like the one I've just had with Tendai now, please press and subscribe, like and share. Also go down below this video. We have a lot of content that sits there, particularly on our website. We have podcasts that sit there. All our conversations are on our website for your listening pleasure and for your viewing pleasure. We value the comments that you share after watching the episodes. Thank you so much. Until next week, cheers to you all.